Every rule has an exception. We all remember the classics, the Marios, the Crash Bandicoots, and the Sonics of the world. While at times they can be pretty divisive, these games have absolutely massive fan bases with tons of love and support behind them. The fact that they're still thriving to this day is incredible, but because of this, many smaller games out there can often just be left overshadowed. A lot of lesser known development studios tried to capitalize on the success of the 3D platforming genre and get a piece of the action, but generally these attempts, while admirable, were often forgotten, lost in the sands of time. I mean, when your competition is arguably the most iconic video game series in history, it doesn't take a genius to see why. However, on rare occasion, it's very possible for a relatively small game to capture the hearts of many and carve its own niche in the gaming industry, much like the one I'll be talking about today. I'm FibreOpticBroadbean, and this is why I love Ty the Tasmanian Tiger. Ty the Tasmanian Tiger is a classic 3D platformer and takes place when the evil cassowary known as Boss Cass attempts to steal 5 ancient talismans. These talismans are used to open some kind of portal to another dimension, and Cass attempts to take advantage of this by banishing all of the world's mammals into it. Luckily, a band of Tasmanian tigers barely managed to knock the talismans out of Cass's grasp but couldn't escape from the portal in time. This leaves young Ty as the last of his kind. With his family on the line, he needs to recover all 5 talismans and defeat Boss Cass once and for all. Sure, it's a fairly simple plot, but it gets the job done. Besides that, the game is set in Australia, which pretty much sets the tone for the whole adventure. Much of your exploration will take place in Australian-themed locations like the safari in the outback, featuring the beautiful sights, scenery, and
sand, red earth, and rock, and some more sand, and another rock, and more
That's another thing I've got to mention. All the characters speak with Australian accents, and it's honestly amazing. The game's cast of characters feels very alive as a result. I love just seeing the interactions between them. With characters like Maury, Professor Julius, and Ranger Ken, I always get a kick out of the dialogue. Of course, the Australianness of it all also bleeds into the game's sense of humour, which never fails to put a smile on my face. Take the first level. When you start out, you only have one boomerang, but you need 2 of them to use all of Ty's abilities, so Maury helpfully chips in by saying,
"Listen, mate, I solved your problem. I found you a second boomerang. See that tree over there? Yeah? Well, it's not there."
That's actually brilliant. Unlike a lot of other games from the era, Ty doesn't take itself too seriously, and I just love that. Ty himself is also a really cool character, and I mean that in more ways than one. When compared to a lot of other main characters, he tends to be a lot more chill and laid back, personality-wise. He often just goes along with what the other characters are saying, or just shrugs things off, which can be pretty humorous at times. This helps him to stand out from all of the other platforming mascots, which is also undoubtedly helped by his design. He looks very bold and striking, from his sharp flicks of hair to his bright red scarf and shorts to even his weapons of choice, the boomerangs. These are great fun to use. It's very satisfying to chuck them at enemies, and I love the little whirring sound they make as they cut through the air. Ty can also use the boomerangs to glide around somehow, allowing him to cross large gaps and reach far off platforms. For a seemingly simple weapon, they really tried to cram a lot of utility into it, and that's not all. Over the course of the game, Julius creates these new elemental boomerangs like the flamerangs, which are used to set things on fire, and the frosty rangs, which can freeze enemies. If you find enough golden cogs, which are one of the game's collectibles, Julius will also be able to create techno rangs. These are optional boomerangs you can unlock, and some of these are fantastic. You've got the zoomerangs, which go further than the normal boomerangs and allow you to zoom in and hit far off targets with pinpoint accuracy. The kaboomerang, which causes massive explosions and is ridiculously fun to use, and probably my personal favourite, the multi-rangs, which let you throw out so many boomerangs at a time and just continuously lob them at enemies. To defeat enemies, you'll be using a combination of the different boomerangs and also Ty's powerful homing bite attack. Oftentimes, you'll need to use these 2 attack variants in conjunction to defeat certain enemies, adding more depth to the game's seemingly simple combat mechanics. Some enemies will require you to bite first to weaken their defenses, for example, and then you have a window to attack with your boomerangs. Sometimes you can even use the elemental rangs a bit creatively, like freezing enemies with the frosty rangs and then finishing them off with the bite. When you're cruising through the levels, the enemies aren't total pushovers, but they don't outstay their welcome either. It's a nice balance. As for the levels themselves, they're a bit hit and miss. I guess the logical place to start would be with the game's hub world, Rainbow Cliffs, which is, I suppose it's alright in the sense that it does what it's supposed to do as a hub world by connecting the individual worlds together, but it doesn't really do a whole lot aside from that. The place is kind of visually uninteresting, with the scenery mostly consisting of just
Sand, red earth, and rock, and some more sand.
There aren't very many landmarks or set pieces to distinguish between it all. Level entrances are just marked by these portals, which, don't get me wrong, is totally fine, but I love when hub worlds and platformers kinda have an area prior to each level which matches it thematically. Banjo-Kazooie is the main example that springs to mind. As a result, Rainbow Cliffs ends up feeling big and empty, and there isn't much to do. Navigating through it isn't particularly fun either, as it doesn't really test your platforming skill in any way, since a lot of the time you'll just be walking through it. Compare that to hub worlds like Delfino Plaza or Gruntilda's Lair. Those feel like custom-built playgrounds, tailored specifically to their respective characters and their abilities, and are packed full to the brim with secrets to find. That's not to say Rainbow Cliffs does a particularly bad job or anything, it's just a bit bare bones as far as hub worlds go. In terms of the other levels though, there are a few different styles. You'll get some levels which are generally linear, while others can be a lot bigger and more open-ended, and for the most part, these are really enjoyable. However, I do think some of the larger levels suffer from a similar problem to Rainbow Cliffs, as that feeling of emptiness is often present here. A couple of the level themes are also repeated, like how there are multiple beach levels, multiple snow levels, and multiple jungle levels, all with the same aesthetics. However, I'd argue that for the most part their layouts are distinct enough to set them apart from one another. Aside from that though, there's a lot to love about these places. Many of them challenge you, testing your abilities with moving platforms with a few simple switch puzzles sprinkled in for good measure. I think my favourite level has to be the final one, leading up to Cass's Crest. It consists almost completely of good old-fashioned, pure, uninterrupted platforming challenges. It takes a mostly linear approach, and while I do tend to prefer my platforming levels to be more open-ended, this is one instance in which the linearity really works. Other levels, specifically the wooded theme ones, have these awesome water slides, which are so much fun to go down. You can either take it nice and slow to avoid bumping into obstacles, or speed along without a care in the world at the risk of getting hit. Also of note is that each level has a race mission in which you'll have to run from the start of the level to a designated finish point, and these are sweet. To be able to just speed through the levels without worrying about collectibles is always a nice change of pace, and the races are often accompanied by some awesome music. Like, tell me that doesn't sound epic. For the most part though, Ty's soundtrack is pretty chill, making for some rather pleasant background music, but it really kicks into gear here. Additionally, dispersed throughout the game there are a few water levels and swimming segments as well, which are actually pretty solid. The swimming controls feel great. Ty moves quickly in the water and can make turns smoothly thanks to his handy aquarangs. To be honest, Ty in general just feels good to control. He moves and jumps around very naturally, and the fact that you can just throw out your boomerangs while running around makes everything flow nicely. Obviously, this is critical in a platformer, so I'm glad that Chrome Studios were able to nail the fluidity of Ty's movement. If anything, I only honestly have one minor gripe with it, that being that the gliding feels a little on the slow side, but that's just being a bit nitpicky. That's not to say that the game was without its flaws though, because there are a few instances where it can be a tad annoying. In each world there are 300 opals to collect, and getting all of them will give you a Thunder Egg, one of the game's main collectibles. This can be a bit of a pain. A lot of the time I was on something like 297 or 299 opals and had to spend ages travelling through the world looking for the last ones. In fairness, despite Banjo-Kazooie being one of my favourite games of all time, I have to admit that at times it does suffer from similar problems. Most notably, getting all 100 notes in a level can be similarly annoying when you're playing through for the first time. However, I will say that the problem is less apparent in Banjo than in Ty, since it's a lot easier to miss opals than it is to miss notes, and then there's also the fact that travelling through the worlds in Ty usually involves a lot more walking and a lot less platforming. As with the game's respective hub worlds, getting from point A to B in Banjo-Kazooie World feels like hopping and skipping around a packed playground, while in some of Ty's larger worlds it tends to be a bit of a less enthralling trek. I can forgive this though, since it only becomes an issue if you're going for 100%, and I doubt the majority of players would bother. In the grand scheme of things, this is just a small small issue in a really good game. Every rule has an exception. At around the time of Ty's release, many other platformers tried to compete with the best just like it did. The majority of these games fizzled out over time, but Ty was different. Ty was the exception. Sure, it didn't quite have the level of polish of say Mario or Spyro, and it didn't quite rise to the same heights that these games did, but realistically, what can you expect? Ty the Tasmanian Tiger wasn't perfect, no doubt, but it still remains a solid platforming experience, and I enjoyed my time playing it. It was a great effort from a small development studio to take a crack at the genre, and I'd say it definitely paid off. The game managed to garner somewhat of a cult following, and as a result of this, had an exceedingly successful Kickstarter to port it over to the Switch in HD. With the sequel now on Switch as well, I definitely want to give it a shot at some point. I've heard good things about Ty 2, so I'm really excited to play it. I can only hope that the cutscenes are on the same level as the first games.
On your mate, you did it.